Okay, so let's bring this home this week. Risk management continued, right? There's some definitions that we need to be aware of. The criterion most commonly used when evaluating a strategy, when we implement these info security controls that we've been talking about, um, is economic feasibility, right? I've tried to tie the policy you recommend as information security professionals uh, to making sure the business value is continued. Remember that term, order to cash, never interrupted. So if you've ever had a budget fight and not get what you asked for, largely it's because there's a business decision based on this risk appetite and risk tolerance that we have been talking about. I mentioned that in the stakeholders conversation. We want to consider what we're doing in terms of a risk assessment, right? So to evaluate what could go wrong, we want to discuss the likelihood that something could happen, right? If in such an event that it occurs, right? The harm that can happen, and so we want to identify the inherent risks on relevant threats and their sources and their vulnerabilities. We also want to determine the impact. So I just said threat and impact, right? And that's, if you go back to the stakeholder slide, that's really what I was talking about here. Here's the threat, that's the impact, and then we're going to discuss the probability of it too, right? And so inherent risk is the risk before security measures are put in place. A threat is what information security is going to focus on, right? The threat source is the intent or method target. Where's it going? The vulnerability is not good or bad by itself. It's just a weakness that can be exploited by a threat. I'll tell you what, no matter how much security we'll put into new tools, new processes, new policies, there is always, because most of these large companies have legacy systems on it may still be supported or may not be. A company I was in last had servers that were not supported by the operating system, which creates huge vulnerabilities. It's not getting patched. It's not getting updates. So what are your vulnerabilities, right? Not just in the current, but think backwards, right? Because once they have access to my network, they can do me damage, right? Impact, I mentioned, is the harm. The likelihood of the occurrence is the likelihood. Let's see if I address that on the not yet. The likelihood of the occurrence is the probability, that probability times impact on the stakeholder slide I referred to. And that's really the basic definition of a risk. It's probability times impact. And then we have to consider in our policy effort what control, right? What are we going to do to prevent, deter, detect, or respond? Those are NIST related topic, right? Prevent, deter, detect, and respond, right? And NIST would use categories like ID, prevent, detect, respond, etc. So very similar. Those are the controls. And then, of course, there's always residual risk, which I just touched on. Now, the threat of, for example, of obtaining unauthorized access to data, that's a threat. The threat source might be some hacker, some cyber criminal, maybe a nation state like Russia. And the vulnerability is maybe the stores of data is that the system that has the data is internet facing, right, where they can get access to it, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really very interesting how that can be laid out step by step. Now I wanted to show you here that risk equals really probability times impact. But I always include another definition with risk just to enhance our understanding. And it really largely is described by these definitions that we just talked about. And so risk here is equal to the vulnerability, right? A vulnerability is just that by itself. It's not harmful. That is been exploited, notice the E, right, by a threat, right? So I take the definition risk equals probability times impact, and that does formally define your risk. But risk is further understood by vulnerabilities that are exploited by a threat. I think those are a couple of great definitions. Now, qualitative then assessment of risk would be a value-based assessment, like subject matter expertise, right? And it's used to identify the seriousness of a threat. After that, we want to do quantitative analysis. And so we want to put dollars to the actual threat. And so in qualitative, I'm going to identify the asset, then I'm going to identify the threat, then I'm going to identify then I'm going to assess the threat, then I'm going to analyze the and prioritize the impact based on that. Then I'm going to look to control it or remediate it, and then look at residual risks. That's qualitative. In quantitative now, I'm really looking to apply dollars and cents to each risk, right? And so what I'm going to do is apply some formulas. And I'm going to try and figure out SLE, right? Single loss expectancy. So I take that asset value that I determined. Maybe it's a server that I can't afford to lose because it's processing cash payments. And what is the EF, the exposure factor? Exposure could be just to failure by itself. Doesn't have to be, the threat can be equipment failure, or it could be the threat from another actor. And once I have the SLE, the single loss expectancy, I can calculate it on an annual basis called ALE, which is that SLE times annual rate of occurrence. How often does it occur? Once every 2 years, once every 4 years, right? You come up with a factor. And so now I've determined my single loss expectancy and my annual loss expectancy, which is going to really tie to the budgets that we are working on. So in continuing this conversation then with risk assessment methodologies, there are components of risk assessment methodology that include a defined process and a risk model and that assessment approach that I've just talked about, right? And so the three most common or well-known methodologies is called OCTAVE is one of them. That stands for Operationally Critical Threat, Asset, and Vulnerability Evaluation. And it was developed by the response team at Carnegie Mellon. They actually have a center there, a CERT coordination center at Carnegie Mellon. Another approach is the FAIR methodology, which is gaining traction and a very good one. And that stands for Factor Analysis of Information Risk, right? Where it incorporates a higher sense of risk financials into the assessment. And then there's the NIST Risk Management Framework, which is another option for you. I will say that OCTAVE is a flexible and self-directed risk assessment approach, right? And so the team is going to draw on a lot of people around the company to define the current state of security and to develop a strategy. And it can usually be tailored, right, which is nice. And OCTAVE then is a framework for identifying and managing security risks. I did want to say about FAIR is it does quantify and manage risk by using, and it's the only international standard that uses a quantitative model for information security and operational risk, right? And so it's really quite robust, and you can contract with a lot of companies that can help provide support there. Wrapping it up, getting to the end of this week. So the risk treatment strategy that attempts to reduce the impact of the loss caused by some incident that happens, right, like a disaster or an attack. Through this requires effective contingency planning And that's what ALE, SLE, and ALE were developing. That's part of effective contingency planning to help you mitigate the risk and develop your strategy, right? Which is very important. You want to consider offensive controls as well as defensive controls. So an offensive control might be to eliminate the vulnerability itself, like patching. A defensive control is designed to respond to the threat source. For example, maybe you get an alert, right? And take action that way, right? You may even risk transfer as a risk mitigation strategy. You may transfer the risk to a third party. Insurance does that, right? You may risk share, where you want to shift a portion of the responsibility to another organization, right? So you can risk share or risk transfer. There's risk reduction or risk avoidance. The only way to do risk avoidance is to avoid the very activity that leads to the risk itself, right? And so some mitigation examples might be to enforce technical controls such as RAID or high availability or firewalls or encryption or IDS, or you might use honeypots, patching, or antivirus, right? You might do failover would be another mitigation, right? So I used to have web filtering servers, and when one would fail, go bad, it would fail over to the next one and give me time to manage the server to bring it back online. Usually resulted in a reboot was all. I could do data loss prevention as a risk reduction or risk mitigation strategy. I could make sure change management, an active change management program, is part of your implementation process, and that's a mitigation aspect. Incident response, we don't often think of it this way. We just think of, oh gosh, what went wrong? Get incident response to react. Well, they're really a mitigation technique if we think about it. Blow your mind, right? And so we could also do things like reassess user rights, configurations, access controls, like least privilege, which we talked about in week 1. We could do routine audits of our system, which is, to me, part of hardening. And we could make sure we're able to enforce our policies and procedures. So that's kind of it. There's your summary. I've enjoyed my time with you. I look forward to seeing you online in the discussions, etc. Thanks, guys. Have a great week.